History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4, The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 4, The Disputed Legacies of the Near East. Byzantium was not the only temptation to the predators prowling about the Near East. Indeed, it survived their attentions longer than its old enemy, the Abbasid Caliphate. The Arab Empire slipped into decline and disintegration, and from the 10th century we enter an age of confusion, which makes any brief summary of what happened a despairing exercise. There was no takeoff into sustained growth, such as the flowering of commerce and the emergence of moneyed men outside the ruling and military hierarchies might have seemed to promise. Rapacious and arbitrary expectations by government may be the basic explanation, but for all the comings and goings of the rulers and raiders, nothing disturbed the foundations of Islamic society. The whole area from the Levant to the Hindu Kush was pervaded for the first time in history by a single religion, and it was to endure. Within that zone, the Christian inheritance of Rome hung on as a major cultural force only until the 11th century, bottled up beyond the Taurus in Asia Minor. After that, Christianity declined in the Near East to become only a matter of communities tolerated by Islam. The stability and deep rootedness of Islamic societal, social, and cultural institutions were enormously important. They far transcended the weaknesses, which were mainly political and administrative, of the semi autonomous states which emerged to exercise power under the formal supremacy of the caliphate in its decadent period. About them, little need to be said. Interesting to Arabists, though, they need to be noted here rather as convenient landmarks than for their own sake. The most important and strongest of them was ruled by the Fatimid dynasty, which controlled Egypt, most of Syria and the Levant, and the Red Sea coast. This territory included the great shrines of Mecca and Medina, and therefore the profitable and important pilgrim trade. On the borders of Anatolia and northern Syria, another dynasty, the Hamdanid, stood between the Fatimids and the Byzantine Empire, while the heartland of the Caliphate, Iraq and western Iran, together with Azerbaijan, was ruled by the Buyid. Finally, the northeastern provinces of Khorasan, Sijistan, and Transoxiana had passed to the Samanids. Listing these four groupings of power far from exhausts the complexity of the unsettled Arab world of the 10th century, but it provides all the background now needed to narrate the unrolling of the process by which two new empires appeared within Islam, one based on Anatolia and one on Persia. The thread is provided by a Central Asian people already introduced into this story, the Turks. Some of them had been granted a home by the Sassanids in their last years in return for help. In those days, the Turkish Empire, if that is the right word for their tribal confederation, ran right across Asia. It was their first great era. Like that of other nomadic peoples, this ascendancy soon proved to be transient. The Turks faced at the same time intertribal divisions and a resurgence of Chinese power, and it was on a divided and disheartened people that there had fallen the great Arab onslaught. In 667, the Arabs invaded Transoxiana, and in the next century they finally shattered the remains of the Turkish Empire in Western Asia. They were only stopped at last in the 8th century by the Khazars, another Turkish people. Before this, the Eastern Turkish Confederation had broken up. In spite of this collapse, what had happened was very important. For the first time, a nomadic polity of sorts had spanned Asia, and it had lasted for more than a century. All four of the great contemporary civilizations, China, India, Byzantium, and Persia, had felt bound to undertake relations with the Turkish Khans, whose subjects had learned much from these contacts. Among other things, they acquired the art of writing. The first surviving Turkish inscription dates from the early 8th century. Yet, in spite of this, for long stretches of Turkish history, we must rely upon other people's accounts and records, for no Turkish authority seems to go back beyond the 15th century, and the archaeological record is sporadic. This, combined with the fragmentation of the Turkish tribes, makes for obscurity until the 10th century. Then came the collapse of the Tang dynasty in China, a great event which offered important opportunities to the Eastern and Sinicized Turks, just at the moment when signs of weakness were multiplying in the Islamic world. One was the emerging of Abbasid successor states. Turkish slaves or Mamluks had long served in the Caliphate's army. Now they were employed as mercenaries by the dynasties which tried to fill their vacuum of power. But the Turkish peoples themselves were again on the move by the 10th century. In the middle of it, a new dynasty re established Chinese power and unity. Perhaps it was this which proved the decisive impetus for another of the long shunting operations by which Central Asian peoples jostled one another forward to other lands. Whatever the cause, a people called the August Turks were in the van of those who pressed into the northeastern lands of the old caliphate and set up their own new states there. One clan among them were the Seljuks. They were notable because they were already Muslims. In 960, they had been converted by the assiduous missionary efforts of the Samanids when still in Transoxiana. Many of the leaders of the new Turkish regimes were former slave soldiers of the Arab Persians. One such group were the Ghaznavids, a dynasty who briefly built a huge dominion which stretched into India. This was also the first post Abbasid regime to choose its generals as sultans or heads of state. But they were in their turn pushed aside as new nomadic invaders arrived. The Augusts came in sufficient numbers to produce a major change in the ethnic composition of Iran and also in its economy. In another way, too, their arrival means a deeper change than any preceding one and opened a new phase of Islamic history. Because of what the Samanids had done, some of the Oghuz Turks were already Muslim and respected what they found. They now began the translation into Turkish of the major works of the Arabic and Persian scholarship, which was to give the Turkish peoples access to Arab civilization as never before. Early in the 11th century, the Seljuks crossed the Oxus too. This was to lead to the creation of a second Turkish empire, which lasted until 1194, and in Anatolia to 1243. After evicting the Ghaznavids from eastern Iran, the Seljuks turned on the Boyards and seized Iraq, thus becoming the first Central Asian invaders of historical times to penetrate further than the Iranian plateau. Perhaps because they were Sunniites, they seem to have been readily welcomed by many of the former subjects of the Shiite Boyards. They went on, though to much greater deeds than this. After occupying Syria and Palestine, they invaded Asia Minor, where they inflicted the Byzantines one of the worst defeats of their history at Manzikert in 1071. Significantly, the Seljuks called the Sultanate they set up there the Sultanate of Rome, for they saw themselves henceforth as the inheritors of the old Roman territories. That Islam should have a foothold inside the old Roman Empire touched off crusading zeal in the West. It also opened Asia Minor to the settlement of the Turks. In many ways, then, the Seljuks played an outstanding historic role. Not only did they begin the conversion of Asia Minor from Christianity to Islam, but they provoked the Crusades and long bore the brunt of resisting them too. This cost them heavily on other fronts. By the mid 12th century, Seljuk power was already dwindling in the Iranian lands. Nevertheless, the Seljuk Empire lasted long enough to make possible a final crystallization over the whole Islamic heartlands of a common culture and of institutions which this time included Turkish peoples. This was less because Seljuk government innovated than because it recognized social and in Islam that meant religious realities. The essence of the Seljuk structure was tribute rather than administrative activity. It was something of a confederation of tribes and localities and was no more capable of standing up to long term stress than its predecessors. The central apparatus of the empire was its armies and what was necessary to maintain them. Locally, the notables of the ulema, the teachers and religious leaders of Islam, ruled. They provided a consolidation of authority and social custom which would survive the caliphates and become the cement of Islamic society all over the Middle East. They would run things until the coming of nationalism in the 20th century. For all the divisions of schools within the ulema, it provided at local levels a common cultural and social system, which ensured that the loyalty of the masses would be available to new regimes which replaced one another at the top and might have alien origins. It provided political spokesmen who could assure satisfaction at the local level and legitimize new regimes by their support. This produced one of the most striking differences between Islamic and Christian society. Religious elites were the key factor in the ulema. They organized the locally religiously based community so that the bureaucracy in the Western sense was not needed. Within the political divisions of the Islamic world, in the age of the Caliphate's decadence, these elites provided its social unity. The Seljuk pattern spread over the Arabic world and was maintained under the successor empires. Another basic institution was the use of slaves, a few as administrators but many in the armies. Though the Seljuks granted some great fiefs in return for military service, it was the slaves, often Turkish, who provided the real force on which the regime rested its armies. Finally, it relied also on the maintenance, where possible, of the local grandee, Persian or Arab. The declining years of the Seljuk regime exposed the weaknesses in these structures. It depended heavily for its direction upon the availability of able individuals supported by tribal loyalties. But the Turks were thin on the ground and could not keep their subjects' loyalties if they did not succeed. When the first wave of Muslim settlement in Anatolia was spent, that area was still only superficially Turkish, and Muslim towns stood in the middle of a countryside, linguistically distinct. Local language was not Arabicized, as it was further south, and the submergence of the Greek culture of the area was only very slowly achieved. Further east, the first Muslim lands to be lost went to the pagans in the 12th century. A nomad ruler, widely supposed in the West to be a Christian king, Prester John, on his way from Central Asia to help the Crusaders, took Transoxiana from the Seljuks. The crusading movement was in part a response to the establishment of Seljuk power. The Turks, perhaps because of their late conversion to Islam, were less tolerant than the Arabs. They began to trouble Christian pilgrims going to the holy places. The other causes which promoted the Crusades belonged rather to the European than the Islamic history and can be dealt with elsewhere. But by 1100, the Islamic world felt itself on the defensive, even though the Frankish threat was not yet grave. Still, the reconquest of Spain had begun, and the Arabs had already lost Sicily. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, was favored by Muslim divisions, which enabled the invaders to establish four Latin states in the Levant: the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its three fiefs, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. They were not to have much of a future, but in the early 12th century, their presence seems ominous to Islam. The Crusaders' success provoked Muslim reaction, and a Seljuk general seized Mosul as the center from which he built up a new state in northern Mesopotamia and Syria. He recaptured Edessa 1144. His son saw the possibilities of exploiting the Christians' alienation of the local Muslim population by bad treatment. It was a nephew of this prince, Saladin, who seized power in Egypt in 1171, declaring the Fatimid Caliphate at an end. Saladin was a Kurd. He came to be seen as the hero of the Muslim reconquest of the Levant, and he remains a captivating figure even after strenuous efforts by unromantic and skeptical scholars to cut through the image of the beau ideal of Saracenic chivalry. The fascination he exercised over the minds of his Christian contemporaries was rooted in paradoxes, which must have had real educational force. He was indisputably a pagan, yet he was said to be good, a man of his word and just in his dealings. He was chivalrous, yet of a world that did not know the knightly ideal. This puzzled some Frenchmen so much that they were forced to believe that he had in fact been knighted by a Christian captive, and that he baptized himself on his deathbed. On a more mundane level, Saladin's first great triumph was the recapture of Jerusalem, 1187, which provoked a new and third crusade, 1189 to 1192. This could achieve little against him, though it further intensified the irritation of Muslims who now began to show a quite new and unprecedented bitterness and ideological hostility towards Christianity. Persecution of Christians followed, and with it began the slow but irreversible decline of the formerly large Christian populations of the Muslim lands. Saladin founded a dynasty, the Ubayyad Sultans, which ruled the Levant, outside the Crusader enclaves, Egypt and the Red Sea coast. It lasted until it was replaced by the rulers drawn from its own palace guards, the Turkish Mamluks. These were to be the destroyers of the remaining Crusader conquests in Palestine. The revival of the caliphate, which followed at Cairo, it was given to a member of the Abbasid house, is of small significance in comparison with this. It registered, nevertheless, that so far as Islam still had a preponderant power and a cultural focus, both were now to be found in Egypt. Baghdad was never to recover. The Mamluks had another great achievement to their credit by that time. It was they who finally halted the tide of a conquest far more threatening than that of the Franks, when it had been rising for more than half a century. This was the onslaught of the Mongols, whose history makes nonsense of chronological and territorial divisions. In an astonishingly short time, this nomadic people drew into their orbit China, India, the Near East, and Europe, and left ineffaceable marks behind them. Yet there is no physical focus for their history except the felt tents of their rulers' encampment. They blew up like a hurricane to terrify half a dozen civilizations, slaughtered and destroyed on a scale the 20th century alone has emulated, and then disappeared almost as suddenly as they came. They demand to be considered alone as the last and most terrible of the nomadic conquerors. 12th century Mongolia is as far back as a search for their origins need go. A group of people speaking the languages of the family called Mongol, who had long demanded the attention of Chinese governments, then lived there. Generally, China played off one of them against another in the interests of their own security. They were barbarians, not much different in their cultural level from others who have already crossed these pages. Two tribes among them, the Tatars and that which became known as the Mongols, competed, and on the whole, the Tatars had the best of it. They drove one young Mongol to extremes of bitterness and self assertion. The date of his birth is uncertain, but in the 1190s he became Khan to his people. A few years later, he was supreme among the Mongol tribes and was acknowledged as such by being given the title of Chengiz Khan. By an Arabic corruption of this name, he was to become known in Europe as Genghis Khan. He extended his power over the other peoples in Central Asia and in 1215 defeated, though he did not overthrow, the Qin state in northern China and Manchuria. This was only the beginning. By the time of his death in 1227, he had become the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. He seems unlike all earlier nomads warlords. Chengiz genuinely believed he had a mission to conquer the world. Conquest, not booty or settlement, was his aim, and what he conquered, he often set about organizing in a systematic way. This led to a structure which deserves the name empire more than do most of the nomadic polities. He was superstitious, tolerant of religions other than his own paganism, and, said one Persian historian, used to hold in esteem beloved and respected sages and hermits of every tribe, considering this a procedure to please God. Indeed, he seems to have held that he was himself the recipient of a divine mission. This religious eclecticism was of the first importance, as was the fact that he and his followers, except for the Turks who joined them, were not Muslims, as the Seljuks had been when they arrived in the Near East. Not only was this a matter of moment to Christians and Buddhists, they were both Nestorians and Buddhists among the Mongols. But it meant that the Mongols were not identified with the religion of the majority in the Near East. In 1218, Genghis Khan turned to the west and the era of Mongol invasions opened in Transoxiana and northern Iran. He never acted carelessly, capriciously, or without premeditation. But it may well be that the attack was provoked by the folly of a Muslim prince who killed his envoys. From there, Genghis went on to a devastating raid into Persia, followed by a swing northward through the Caucasus into South Russia and returned, having made a complete circuit of the Caspian. All this was accomplished by 1223. Bukhara and Samarkand were sacked with massacres of the townspeople, which were meant to terrify others who contemplated resistance. Surrender was always the safest course with the Mongols, and after it, several minor peoples were to survive with nothing worse than the payment of a tribute and the arrival of a Mongol governor. Transoxiana never recovered its place in the life of Islamic Iran after this. Christian civilization was given a taste of Mongol prowess by the defeat of the Gregorians in 1221 and of the southern Russian princes 2 years later. Even these alarming events were only the overture to what was to follow. Chengiz died in the east in 1227, but his son and successor returned to the west after completing the conquest of northern China. In 1236, his armies poured into Russia. They took Kiev and settled on the lower Volga, from where they organized a tributary system for the Russian principalities they had not occupied. Meanwhile, they raided Catholic Europe. The Teutonic Knights, the Poles, and the Hungarians all went down before them. Krakow was burnt and Moravia devastated. A Mongol patrol crossed into Austria, while the pursuers of the King of Hungary chased him through Croatia and finally reached Albania before they were recalled. The Mongols left Europe because of dissension among their leaders and the arrival of the news of the death of the Khan. A new one was not chosen until 1246. A Franciscan friar attended the ceremony. He was there as an emissary of the Pope. So did a Russian Grand Duke, a Seljuk Sultan, the brother of the Abuyid Sultan of Egypt, an envoy from the Abbasid Caliphate, a representative of the King of Armenia, and two claimants to the Christian throne of Georgia. The election did not solve the problems posed by dissension among the Mongols, and it was not until another great Khan was chosen, after his predecessor's death had ended a short reign, that the stage was set for another Mongol attack. This time it fell almost entirely upon Islam and provoked unwarranted optimism among Christians who noted also the rise of Nestorian influence at the Mongol court. The area, nominally still subject to the caliphate, had been in a state of disorder since Genghis Khan's campaign. The Seljuks of Rome had been defeated in 1243 and were not capable of asserting authority. In this vacuum, relatively small and local Mongol forces could be effective, and the Mongol Empire relied mainly upon vassals among numerous local rulers. The campaign was entrusted to the younger brother of the great Khan and began with the crossing of the Oxus on New Year's Day 1256. After destroying the notorious sect of the assassins en route, he moved on Baghdad, summoning the caliph to surrender. The city was stormed and sacked, and the last Abbasid caliph murdered because there were superstitions about shedding his blood. He is supposed to have been rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. It was a black moment in the history of Islam, as everywhere Christians took heart and anticipated the overthrow of their Muslim overlords. When, the following year, the Mongol offensive was launched against Syria, Muslims were forced to bow to the cross in the streets of a surrendered Damascus, and a mosque was turned into a Christian church. The Mamluks of Egypt were next on the list for the conquest when the great Khan died. The Mongol commander in the west favored the succession of his younger brother, Kublai Khan, far away in China. But he was distracted and withdrew many of his men to Azerbaijan to wait on events. It was on a weakened army that the Mamluks fell at the Goliath Spring near Nazareth on 3rd September 1260. The Mongol general was killed. The legend of Mongol invincibility was shattered, and a turning point in the world history was reached. For the Mongols, the age of conquest was over, and that of consolidation had begun. The unity of Genghis Khan's empire was at an end. After civil war, the legacy was divided among the princes of his house under the nominal supremacy of his grandson, Kublai Khan of China, who was to be the last of the great Khans. The Russian Khanate was divided into three. The Khanate of the Golden Horde ran from the Danube to the Caucasus, and to the east of it lay the Chibanid Khanate in the north. It was named after its first Khan, and that of the White Horde in the south. The Khanate of Persia included much of Asia Minor and stretched across Iraq and Iran to the Oxus. Beyond that lay the Khanate of Turkestan. The quarrels of these states left the Mamluks free to mop up the Crusader enclaves and to take revenge upon the Christians, who had compromised themselves by collaboration with the Mongols. In retrospect, it is still far from easy to understand why the Mongols were so successful for so long. In the West, they had the advantage that there was no single great power, such as Persia or the Eastern Roman Empire had been, to stand up to them. But in the East, they defeated China, undeniably a great imperial state. It helped too that they faced divided enemies. Christian rulers toyed with the hope of using Mongol power against Muslims and even against one another, while any combination of the Christian civilizations with China against the Mongols was inconceivable given Mongol control of communication between the two. Their tolerance of religious diversity, except during the period of implacable hatred of Islam, also favored the Mongols. Those who submitted peacefully had little to fear. Would be resistors could contemplate the ruins of Bukhara or Kiev, or the pyramids of skulls where they had been Persian cities. Much of the Mongol success must have been a result of the sheer terror which defeated many of their enemies before they ever came to battle. In the last resort, though, simple military skill explained their victories. The Mongol soldier was tough, well trained, and led by generals who exploited all the advantages which a fast moving cavalry arm could give them. Their mobility was in part the outcome of the care with which reconnaissance and intelligence work was carried out before a campaign. The discipline of their cavalry and their mastery of the techniques of siege warfare, which nonetheless the Mongols preferred to avoid, made them much more formidable than a horde of nomadic freebooters. As conquests continued too, the Mongol army was recruiting specialists among its captives. By the middle of the 13th century, there were many Turks in its ranks. Though his army's needs were simple, the empire of Genghis Khan and, in somewhat less degree, of his successors was an administrative reality over a vast area. One of the first innovations of Genghis was the reduction of Mongol language to writing using the Turkish script. This was done by a captive. Mongol rule always drew willingly upon the skills made available to it by the conquests. Chinese civil servants organized the conquered territories for revenue purposes. The Chinese device of paper money, when introduced by the Mongols into the Persian economy in the 13th century, brought about a disastrous collapse of trade. But the failure does not make the example of the use of alien techniques less striking. In so great an empire, communications were the key to power. A network of post houses along the main roads looked after rapidly moving messengers and agents. The roads helped trade too, and for all their ruthlessness to the cities which resisted them. The Mongols usually encouraged rebuilding and the revival of commerce, from the taxation of which they sought revenue. Asia knew a sort of Pax Mongolica. Caravans were protected against nomadic bandits by the policing of the Mongols, poachers turned gamekeepers. The most successful nomads of all. They were not going to let other nomads spoil their game. Trade was as easy between China and Europe during the Mongol era as at any time. Marco Polo is the most famous of Europe's travelers to the Far East in the 13th century, and by the time he went there, the Mongols had conquered China. But before he was born, his father and uncle had begun travels in Asia, which were to last years. They were both Venetian merchants and were sufficiently successful to set off again almost as soon as they got back, taking the young Marco with them. By sea, too, China's trade was linked with Europe through the port of Ormuz on the Persian Gulf, but it was the land routes to the Crimea and Trebizond which carried most of the skills and materials westward and provided the bulk of Byzantine trade in its last centuries. The land routes depended on the Khans, and, significantly, the merchants were always strong supporters of the Mongol regime. In its relations with the rest of the world, the Mongol Empire came to show the influence of China in its fundamental presuppositions. The Khans were the representatives on earth of the one sky god, Tengri. His supremacy had to be acknowledged, though this did not mean that the practice of other religions would not be tolerated. But it did mean that diplomacy in the West sense was inconceivable. Like the Chinese emperors, whom they were to replace, the Khans saw themselves as the upholders of a universal monarchy. Those who came to it had to come as suppliants. Ambassadors were the bearers of tribute, not the representatives of power of equal standing. When in 1246, emissaries from Rome conveyed papal protests against the Mongol treatment of Christian Europe and a recommendation that he should be baptized, the new Great Khan's reply was blunt. If you do not observe God's command, and if you ignore my command, I shall know you are my enemy. Likewise, I shall make you understand. As for baptism, the Pope was told to come in person to serve the Khan. It was not an isolated message, for another Pope had the same reply from Mongol governor of Persia a year later. If you wish to keep your land, you must come to us in person and thence go on to him, who is master of the earth. If you do not, we know not what will happen. Only God knows.